this evening, good evening, or good morning, or good afternoon to all of you who've taken the time and the efforts to join us on World Cities Day, October the 31st, 2021. And thanks so much to our host, Abidemi Agwor, who's been kind enough to invite 6 panelists from around the world to take part in his discussion around adapting cities for climate resilience, a very topical conversation as COP26 kicks off today. And obviously the question that we're looking at more specifically today, leveraging underground space. And I've got to know Abby over the last year and a half or so as fellow students on the London School of Economics Executive Masters course in Cities, where I've been introduced to Abby's skill set as a tunneler. And we pull his leg mercilessly because most of us think about the surface and what's on top. And Abby's always interested in taking us subterranean. And he's really brought a whole new level of engagement to the discussion, and really excited to be part of this evening. We're also joined by Antonia Conaro from Switzerland, who's joining us, an underground space expert and co-chair for Ithacus. We have in Chicago, Dr. Amara Enya, public policy expert. Also, Amara, well known to us on the course, LSE course, as one of the mayoral candidates for the Chicago mayoral candidacy a year or two ago. In the Netherlands, Han Admiral, urban strategist and co-chair of the Ithacus group. And then in Lahore, Pakistan, Imran Ali Sultan, an urban development expert and also one of the LSE course and candidate members on the LSE Executive Cities course. With that, colleagues, I hope you can see the program. It is quite a tight program, and that's why I'm going to try and push us on, and haven't asked everyone to introduce themselves just in the interest of time. Abby, I do hope you're recording this. I see the cloud is red, meaning that this has been recorded. So please, colleagues, be aware. I am going to suggest to colleagues that you use the chat box to lodge some of your questions. I'm going to use that to try and steer us in terms of the time we have available to address your comments. And the way that we're going to run the program is Abby is going to take us through a keynote presentation, which is going to take us between 8 and 10 minutes. He then has a video he wanted to show us around trying to get us to think and imagine how cities should be thinking about underground spaces. I'll ask for a response from each of our experts on the panel first. And in that time, I'd be asking you to be putting your comments and thoughts in the chat box that I can try and steer us through and get us to a situation where we can facilitate this discussion. Abby is going to be running a number of polls as well, at least 4 polls that he's prepared, including where we're from, so we can get a sense of the geography. But there are 3 others that I haven't yet been aware of. He's put the first one up now, where you're joining us from. You can quickly make your submission, as I now basically ask Abby to take us through his keynote presentation. Abby, I'm going to stop sharing and it's over to you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter. Okay. I've got the dual responsibility of also admitting people, so we still have a couple of people joining in, which is great. Yep. It looks like there's a bit of a lag. I can see that from my.
Take your time, Abby. It's all looking fine. We can see everything. We can hear you loud and clear. Take your time.
Okay. Just trying to figure out which of the screens you have on. Okay. I'm not entirely sure if we've got the start screen, which basically shows. I'll probably just stop and reshare to the.
We could see your slide that was titled Urbanization, Abby.
Okay, awesome. So that's the one we want. Okay, one sec. Okay. It looks like I've pretty much mixed up the screen now. Just a sec.
Again, Abby, what we could see there was your second and third slide. It looked like some sort of the globe, 3 images, different colors. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so I'm sharing the one that's got the urbanization again.
We can see that now, sir.
Okay, so all right, yes. All right, so yeah, sorry for that initial itch. We just kind of ran. So the main purpose of this is basically just to get us to start thinking about the key decisions that we're basically going to be taking. The theme, as we all know, for this event, the World Cities Day, is basically adapting cities for climate resilience, but we've added an extra layer to that, which suggests that underground space use has a critical role to play in us achieving climate resilience for cities. And you know, this image that I have up here, which is a traffic light kind of like indicator, shows from the United Nations Climate Change website that it's up to us to kind of like take a decision on the different futures that lies ahead. Of course, currently we know where we are in terms of the global you know, temperature, which is 1.5 degrees. But you know, every indicator out there basically suggests that this is pretty much creeping up. And you know, no matter how marginal the decisions we take are, there needs to be some level of desperation, some level of acceleration, you know, integrated into whatever processes we need to be looking at. And so, you know, absolutely, you know, for me, everyone, you know, that I speak to about this would basically know that, you know, it's a time for action. It's a time for us to begin to think critically about, you know, decisions that we take and that would, you know, basically put into action for us to be able to achieve, you know, the kind of future that lies ahead. And I'd like to bring to perspective the context of, you know, the global context here. Now, there are a lot of events, you know, that we've basically experienced more recently in the past. And I'll give example of the experience we had in West Africa, the Ebola pandemic. And what that did at the time was, at the point, there was a global fear that Nigeria was going to be the epicenter. But because of the way it was managed and because of the way it was resolved, it basically kind of like abated that, you know, that fear, or that the global risk of Ebola basically becoming what would have been, you know, what we have today in terms of COVID. And from that perspective, we can understand, though from a global point of view, you know, we are millions and miles apart, but at the same time, we are, we are closer than we, you know, expected. And we can see the result of that from COVID. You know, COVID-19 has shown us that no matter how far apart, you know, Wuhan, whatever, you know, when COVID happened, it happened in Wuhan, but within a couple of months, the entire world was on global shutdown. So this is a big and a key reminder of where we are globally and how we need to be looking at these issues. And, you know, we cannot be looking at them in silos. And so that takes me to the next one. And the question here is population a problem? You know, it's a question we ask ourselves. So based on the United Nations Population Division, they expect that the global population, which is currently set at 7.8 billion as of the year 2020, will level out at 2000 by the year 2100 to be about 10 billion, taking into consideration different factors, you know, and one of them being the rate of births per woman, which are the period between 2015-2020 was estimated to be about 2.5 births per woman, and that would basically tailor down or tap it down to 1.9 births per woman women by the year 2095-21. And that's, of course, a long time from now. But all these are basically just words that we're looking at there. But the key question I'd like to ask is, that I also want us to have at the back of our minds while we think about all these things is population the problem? Is he a key problem that we need to be considering? Okay. And of course, this was a slide that was in our screen a couple of times earlier in the slide. And the other question here is urbanization. We all know that urbanization plays a key role in the way cities are shaped and the way cities evolve. And today, 55% of world population live in urban areas. These are facts and figures that are almost sounding like it's like a broken record. We hear this over and over again. And the proportion, the proposition is that this is expected to increase to about 68% by the year 2050. And one of the reasons why we actually focused this session, or what we're talking about during this talk on mainly developing cities, is primarily the fact that urbanization is occurring faster in developing countries. And there are a lot of gaps, there are a lot of challenges, and we tend to think that technology is the only problem, but there are obvious policy, governance, challenges, bottlenecks, excessive bureaucracy, lack of leadership, vision, that drives some of these, decision-making processes or frameworks that, can easily solve some of these problems. So, in developing countries, like it actually does show here, and we could see from this, from the schematic or the diagram here, which I borrowed from one of Antonia's presentation. It highlights, key different hotspots globally, mega cities where you have over 10 million or more people, so, and, we can see this, there are a lot of developing cities that are captured in this, and these are basically, global trends of urbanization. And I want us to also have this at the back of our minds as we get into this discussion, as well, how does the global urbanization trend, what role, how does it play into this, as well? Another key question or another key element or part of our discussion would be the question on how population due to traffic impacts life, impacts, the resilience of a city. 80% of people living in urban areas are exposed to air quality levels that exceed the World Health Organization's guidelines. This is basically reference from the World Health Organization. And, this is, these are facts, these are the informations that have been, put out there. And so, this is something that we really also need to be thinking about. And with the next image here, it's just a question of course, cities now, looking at the way cities are evolving, looking at the way cities are expanding. And when I talk about cities, of course, cities in the global north are a lot more developed and a lot more expansive and mature than cities in global south, and without a lot of efficiency in terms of how people move around. But with cities looking to move away from the original design of central business districts and the locations of premium parts or locations being the premium part of the city, what are the potentials, for us to be able to decentralize, or for people to seamlessly move from one functional location of the city to another? So those are the questions we need to be asking, and how this would significantly play a role in the overall health of the city. So the question here is that the city's health can be measured by how easy, it is to move from one part of the city to another. And there's an image, that a couple of years back, I'll say about 2 years back, that really got me thinking about really what we really need to be doing about our cities. And, I just thought to myself that sometimes, for us to be inspired, we do not really need to think far. We just need to look at what we have next to us. And no matter how ordinary it might look at, I look at the humans versus the city comparison. And, one of the questions, I remember the first day I thought about this, the first thing I went out to check was, the number of or the distance, or how long is the normal arteries, the different vessels we have in the human, and the adults, matured adults, has over 160 kilometers of blood vessels running in their bodies. And we can only imagine if we had half of this lying around the surface, without make the man a lot more resilient, without making him a lot more, it's just a question or something, that we really need to think about. Perhaps there's a lesson we can learn from here as to how, we can fundamentally start thinking about what and how we can build resilience into our cities. And, I haven't, talked about this now. I guess the next thing we really need to be thinking about is exactly what we're doing here today. When we want to achieve, the global context, or achieve this, the context of climate resilience from a global point of view, how do we implement this, and the big question is, and what we always try to do, and Admiral and Antonia would actually even elaborate on this with the works they've been doing with ITACOS over it. And it's the key thing is, a lot of the times we can't do this in silos. It has to be done, on a collaborative and with synergy, on the platform. So when we are conceptualizing and when we are creating a vision of the future of cities where we want to incorporate on-the-ground space use, from the onset, it has to be done from a point of collaboration and synergy. And when we look at the second point, which is basically counteracting the lack of space use in the cities, we really need to, it's something that has to be done intentionally, where, we might imagine, of course, there are cities that are obvious. It's obvious that they do not have space, Singapore, Hong Kong, but there are also cities that, would perhaps have that false sense of security, that they have, they still have value, they still have spaces. But what we really need to be thinking about, is the fact that even if we want to achieve a kind of like decentralized model for cities, we really need to look at how we could maximize the subunits, the different fragments of the cities. And, doing this, with a sense of collaboration from the concept phase, or from the point of vision, would really impact the overall outcome of what we're looking to do. So where we have planners like what we're doing here today, where we have, on the panel, we have experts from the tunneling industry, and we also have experts from different fields of endeavors. We have planners, we have policy experts. And so where we sit down together and we're able to integrate different ideas, and we could also, see the blind spots, that we can see from our, tunnel vision for the different areas of specializations that we have. And so this, for me is, these are the points I would like for us to kind of have at the back of our mind. And finally, I'd like to just leave these words before we just play the video very quickly. It's just a 4 minutes video where it says here, do not follow where the path may lead, but go instead where there's no path and trail. And it's a difficult thing it's a difficult thing to do. But for us to get to a point where cities are developed in such a way that, they are resilient and they are able to accommodate the shocks and stresses that will basically potentially that they would experience, we would need to think outside the box. We would need to think below, the lateral conceptualization that we're normally used to. We need to think below the ground. And so, having said that, I would like us to, just watch this video with every form of intent that we have, and be inspired as well.
Our city mayors, public policy leaders, and our planners face many challenges in the next 40 years. Margareta Wallström says, unless we act now, we will see more and more disasters due to unplanned urbanization and environmental degradation. Juan Clos echoes that, saying we need to demonstrate that change is possible through the genius, creativity, and audacity of people and decision makers to make the wisest choices for our urban future. Imagine a city with a historic centre, a city with planning legislation prohibiting the demolition of heritage buildings, a city with height regulations limiting new buildings to 8 floors. Imagine that historic city centre needing new social and transport infrastructure, living and office space, leisure facilities. Where would you find the space to fit all this in? You'd find it here, in the Earth Scraper, a 65-floor deep, inverted skyscraper. This, find the space to fit all this in. You'd find it here, in the Earth Scraper, a 65-floor deep, inverted skyscraper. This is all the space you need, with no compromise on the existing urban fabric. The Earth Scraper is an inverted pyramid with a central void, allowing all underground habitable space to enjoy natural light and ventilation. In the last 30 years, the world has had to cope with nearly 3,500 floods. Intense rainfall is now a major hazard for cities. So imagine a city with a thriving central business district, but one that is flooded on average once a year, severely disrupting commercial life. How can you prevent this? In Kuala Lumpur, you do it the smart way, with an underground solution combining both a road and a stormwater management tunnel. Next, imagine a city under threat from major earthquakes. A city that has previously experienced the collapse of its vital infrastructure, severely hindering disaster relief efforts. Now imagine that same city making use of resilient underground infrastructure, much less susceptible to earthquakes. A city where even after a major quake, essential aid can be distributed and life protected. As the world's population increases, our cities are becoming increasingly overcrowded, the available space almost all taken. But cities must be livable to be loved. They need open and green areas, public spaces for a society to enjoy. Imagine creating those spaces below the surface, parkland beneath the urban centre. Meet the Low Line, a private initiative in the Lower East Side of New York City, reusing an unwanted, forgotten underground tramway depot and giving it new life. Now imagine your city using its underground space, becoming more resilient against natural disaster and the effects of climate change, developing sustainably through the use of geothermal energy, integrating surface and below surface development, creating new connections and increasing livability, rapidly transporting people through underground systems that double up as cargo and disaster relief infrastructure. We know about underground space. Now you know too.
Abby,
Thank
thanks
you
very
very
much. Abby, thanks for that. Appreciate both the video and your thought-provoking presentation. So there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. A very thought-provoking call to action. And Abby's talked about population growth, the urbanization pressures, and what opportunities the subterranean world can provide. And I'm going to ask Antonia, perhaps just to kick us off with the question around, how and where have we seen vision building and best practice that Abby's talking about? You've shown us a couple of examples there in the video that the team has put together from the what do we call them again? The Itaku, is it? But what in your, sorry, my apologies. You can tell us about it and where you've seen it work best. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Pete. Thanks for that. This is actually a video we put together as part of the ITA, the International Tunnel and Underground Space Association, together with UNISDRR, so the United Nations agency dealing with disaster risk reduction, because it's really supposed to open the eyes of people and of policymakers about the opportunities that the underground space holds in the future development of their cities. Now, when you ask me where is the vision building going on, so we really see clusters in various cities worldwide. As you know from LSE cities, innovation happens in cities, and also what nowadays happens in terms of environmental policy usually is city driven. And we have really small clusters of great thinkers in cities around the world. I would say Southeast Asian cities, Singapore, Hong Kong, also Seoul, Vietnam, and then we have in Europe, London and Paris, for instance, but also in the Netherlands, where there's quite a lot of innovative thinking going on in terms of how we really need to appreciate what the subsurface holds for our cities. And lastly, we have a lot of interest now coming from Latin America, from places like Mexico, from places like Chile, but also Colombia, who really want to consciously attack or really like incorporate in their policy and strategies the subsurface development. And last but not least, I want to point out Think Deep UK. We have two representatives in the audience, as I can see. Think Deep UK is a cluster really trying to get a stake with stakeholders in terms of urban policy in multidisciplinary thinking on the subject.
Thanks so much for that, for those words, Antonia. Really appreciate it. And again, I'm encouraging people to use the text or the chat box there to add some thoughts. Han, I'm going to come to you again as our sort of additional expert on this. And before we go to Amara and Imran for their experiences in Chicago and Lahore, respectively. But again, your thoughts and additions that you'd like to make around Abidemi's proposition.
Well, I'm going to be slightly more provocative, if I may, in the sense that I would say that we've been doing it all wrong. And you can see that from cities like New York and London, who totally depend on their subways, their underground systems to move people about. But what they've effectively done is they've constructed this whole labyrinth of tunnels beneath the city, and they only do one thing: they move people. And I think if we look at the challenges that we're facing, and those challenges were put forward by Abidemi, and you can add on to that the loss of biodiversity and a lot of other things that we haven't mentioned yet. I think the one thing that we can say is that business as usual no longer suffices. We have to start looking at different ways of doing things. And what interests me, for example, in the smart tunnel is that the smart tunnel brought together people that were looking at the traffic issues with the people that were looking at flooding issues. And they started to say, look, can we combine this? Can we bring things together? And can we actually come up with a solution that does more than just one thing? So the difficulty when it comes to our cities in general, but also specifically when we talk about the underground space, you can only use that space once. If you're then going to use it sensibly. Start thinking about what can I combine in terms of uses to make it even more attractive and make it even more attractive also to finance those projects. And I think that is what we need to do. So when you talk about best practices, I think, well, the best practices are still to come. There are a few about, and the last thing that we want to do is to actually look at the subsurface as a last defense position that we have when it comes to creating space that we lack at the surface. We have to start thinking in a different way. What is it that the subsurface has to offer us? What the geosystem services, you could call it, and how do we utilize those in the wisest way? And is that by building a lot of underground systems, or is that, for example, using it for geothermal energy or to store drinking water? Water scarcity of water is another issue that's facing us. So, you know, it is a large discourse that we need to have about our cities and how we want them to develop towards the future. What we're saying is, don't discount the fact that below the surface, there's still a lot of things that you can do as well. But don't go to these single use solutions as we've been doing in the past.
Thanks for the provocation, Han, and for getting us thinking a bit out of our comfort zone. And Amara, I'm coming to you next. As you know, we think of you as being Chicago-based, but you've got a very broad geographic reach. You've got experience all over the globe. What are your thoughts and responses to what you've heard from the tunnelers and the engineers and the thinkers in this space, which is sometimes quite new to others of us? What's your thoughts and responses?
Yeah, so thank you for that. And I want to thank Abi for this really important conversation that I think is fairly new for many of us. At least for me, I think our interactions have really got me thinking more deeply about tunneling and the use of underground space. And so in the video that was shown, what really stood out to me was the underground, essentially the underground skyscraper. So I guess it's not a skyscraper anymore, but it's just going the opposite way. And it's a fascinating concept that is quite jarring, because we don't often think about the use of underground space in the same way that we think of the use of space at the surface level, and the possibility of having something like a skyscraper that's just going underground is really outside of the norm. And so that was what really stood out to me. And then to Han's point, I think one of the biggest challenges is, as he said, the fact that we have a very narrow view of how to use underground space, and cities have built themselves up on that narrow view. And so it's sort of like when we think about the Earth and then we think about the ocean, and it's an entire world in the ocean, right? So there's an entire ecosystem, there's an entire different species, different grades of land, of materials, whether sand and so on and so forth, under the water, that we can't simply have a very narrow view of what it looks like or the possibilities under the water. And I think the same is true when we're talking about underground tunneling, that it is an entire world of possibility just beneath the surface. And when we have that kind of holistic view, it opens up the possibilities for how that space could actually be used. Most cities have taken the transportation use, and it's quite narrow. So in Chicago, for example, we obviously have a subway system, but we also have Wacker Drive, which is the sort of secret pathway that those of us who are in the know use it to bypass the traffic going through downtown at the surface level. It's quite efficient, and it shaves off 15 or 20 minutes of your commute time. But again, there are also folks who are simply unfamiliar with it or are scared or hesitant because it's underground, right? So there's a bit of acclimation that has to happen that cities can do to get people acclimated to the notion of underground space and broadening the uses of underground space. The other thing to consider is in colder climate cities like Chicago, Minneapolis, where we have branched out to create underground tunnel systems for pedestrians, because it's just too cold at the top. So when it does get into those frigid winter months in December, January, February, most of us who work downtown, we're somewhat familiar with this underground system of pedestrian walkways that are connecting buildings, connecting office buildings, connecting train stops. et cetera, because it allows people to avoid having to be out in the elements due to the temperature. And so there are some mechanisms that have been put in place to use underground space, but I think there's so much more that can be done, but it requires cities to really think outside the box. The last underground tunneling proposition we had in Chicago, for better or worse, came from Elon Musk and former Mayor Rahm Emanuel. And I think the context of how it was proposed was problematic, more so than the actual project itself. So it was designed to be an underground tunnel system that would create a linkage from O'Hare Airport, which is our major airport, to downtown. And you could bypass sort of the regular subway, and you could bypass the street traffic. But the way it was presented was as this sort of elite system that was going to service only the wealthy elites that were popping into Chicago, just wanted to go downtown and then go back out. And that presentation, or how it was contextualized, created, in my view, a lot of backlash and people just sort of dismissing the whole tunnel concept outright. So there are considerations about culture and how people are acclimated to the notion, the possibilities of underground space is viable. There's the notion of expanding beyond the traditional uses, again, to Hans' point about just transportation being the only use of underground space. And then we have to be, I think, a lot more aggressive in tying it to when these conversations around climate resiliency and what it means to create resilient cities. That we do have some areas that we haven't explored as much, and that there are possibilities there if we just take those additional steps to look more deeply into those possibilities.
Wow, thanks again, Amara. Very, very expansive, touching on some very important themes there, particularly around the climate, the equity issue, and then the cultural issue. So 3 important elements that you've landed with us. Imran, we're going from the west to the east. I'm coming to you there in Lahore, and would love to hear your thoughts, particularly within the sort of emerging markets context. What's your thinking when you hear about this grand schemes around building into the earth in your thinking, sir?
So looking at Abby's thoughts and other panelists, I was obviously extremely excited, in a sense that before, emerging as an urban practitioner, I had been pilot also. So I always thought, my mind always thought the space in the terms of the territory which we occupy on the aerial views. But again, going underground and thinking and rethinking our cities is quite exciting. And now, that I come from the part of the world, we have, more than 200 million population, particularly Lahore is having more than 12 million population. So over there, the cities have 2 things extremely worrying, challenging. One is the poverty, and second is informality, that the city spaces that have been occupied by the informal, poor people, and it's very difficult whenever we want to initiate any project for their welfare, may it be the drainage lines or the water lines and any other things. So, this is a challenge on our side of the part. Other thing, the good thing is that following the developed world thing, I'm excited to share that a few months back, we actually inaugurated first of our metro train, the light rail train, around 30 kilometers that moves around in Lahore city, and around 6 to 7 kilometers of its passages underground. So from that, the practitioner's point of view, when we were, developing the train lines under that, when we were doing the tunneling, so it was only an engineering issue for us. But when we were going on the upper surface, so we need to actually bulldoze a lot of the properties, the poor households, we had to migrate, and it became really social and sometimes legal and political issues. So the tunneling work that was being an engineering point of view had to be late. It got completed earlier than its target. On the contrary, the easier part from the engineering point of view that need to be done on the surface, because of so many other factors, it got delayed. So, now the kind of that the notion that Abby has presented, this gives us how it makes us the resilient, in a sense that we have already started seeing in the kind of effects of climate change, having a higher rains and having higher side of the heat waves. Now, for example, that if we want to really build back those informal establishment in part of city where poor are living, and we want to give them facilities like sewage lines and like clean drinking water and so many other things, I think without migrating them, going underneath the ground and giving them those facilities and slowly building up. So again, that the underground space is actually opening us all the new avenues. That's great in this thing. Thank you.
Imran, thanks for those insights. Very much appreciated, sir. We're going to head back to the UK, to Nottingham, and Aid. Welcome, sir. Thank you for your question where you talked about the whole question of underground space supporting urban decarbonisation. And Aid, I invite you to expand on that point and talk us through, again, what you've seen and what you think are the opportunities within this space. Over to you, sir.
Thanks for that. I am not a tunneling expert. I'm a process engineer, and in my day job I work in the space of industrial decarbonization. And as you're probably all aware, COP26 is on its way, and there's the target, as Bidemi highlighted, of minimizing global warming and temperature rise. And one of the challenges, looking at various systems, the UK particularly, I mean, quite a significant proportion of carbon emissions are due to heating, basically. So power generation forms one of the largest sources of carbon emissions from the UK and many other countries. But heating, industrial heating, residential heating, and the like, provides quite a significant contribution to our carbon emissions. You probably heard stories about solutions for that, like heat pumps, geothermal, and so on and so forth. And I'm just wondering, I'm putting it out there, I'm trying to understand what ideas we could probably come up with to solve this particular problem, because heating particularly is quite difficult to decarbonize. The hydrogen economy has been proposed to decarbonize quite a number of hard to abate sectors, but heating is probably one of those sectors that you would not want to use hydrogen for, because it's not as efficient as you would like it to be. So I don't know if there are any ideas in terms of, I think geothermal was brought up to, that's one key idea. But I'm just asking the panel and asking the audience ideas about decarbonizing using the underground space.
Thanks for that, Aid. So what we're going to do, we're going to ask for people to respond in the chat box. If anybody would like to respond directly to that, we'll take you just now. I'm going to come to Elizabeth Belpaire. Elizabeth, welcome. If I'm not mistaken, you might be joining us from Switzerland. If I've got that wrong, please correct me. But you also had a point you wanted to raise about the need to think out of the box, and recognizing that there have been challenges, some very serious challenges in respect of particularly public transport and so forth. Would you like to expand on that point, Elizabeth? Hello, Elizabeth. I'm not sure if you can hear us. If not, we can move on. Okay, Antonia, I'm going to come back to you. You've talked about a couple of the outreach programs and research areas that may touch on some of these things. Is that something you'd just like to pick up on and talk about some of these positive examples where you've seen the ability to respond and also build that resilience around flood and earthquake, etc., into the responses that you've developed?
Yeah, I'm happy to do so, Pete. So yeah, picking up on Elizabeth's point, these are issues that we are often confronted with, sort of the threats that the subsurface holds, and these are the ones that sort of stick in people's minds, whereas a lot of the positive aspects are not really known. So this is something we're really focusing on, to show examples of where we're housing vital infrastructure in the underground space, transporting people, but also transporting, I mean, our whole telecom systems, our sewage systems, our water distribution systems. our cities wouldn't function, right? And but more and more we also see opportunities for instance, growing food in the subsurface, which will not be possible in the future in the surface due to climate change, due to land constraints. And we are really just working on that we show in the various activity groups, how does the underground space contribute to sustainability? How does it contribute to resilience? How does it contribute to urban integration, for instance? And really coming up with a lot of case studies and hands-on examples in the various cities, so that people can really get a picture. Yes, I can have a sewage treatment plant in the subsurface and have a housing development on top that heats the housing development with the excess energy. Or I can extract heat out of the London Tube and have warm water in a social housing project on top. And these are also circular systems that, from a circular economic point of view, very interesting for the future, where we're also reducing energy consumption. So even data centers that are massive land eaters and energy consumers, we have examples that we can actually house them in the subsurface and use the excess heat for purposes on the top, and as well reduce the energy demand, because that's another thing people don't know, that in the subsurface we have constant temperatures, so we're actually reducing energy demand. We don't have to heat or cool excessively. So Han and I also came forward with a paper for Middle Eastern cities that are excessively hot, that actually can use the subsurface to have a cool space, or like in Amara's case that she mentioned, very cold cities that want to be protected, so in very adverse climates. So there's a lot of aspects that are not known and that the world should know about and needs to know about.
Thanks again for that share, Antonia. Really appreciate it. And also the links that you've put into the chat box. Again, we point people to not just the video link that's been shared there, but a couple of other resources that are available. Abby, I'm going to come to you just now. I put a proposition in the chat box as we were discussing. One of the things I'm saying is, and perhaps I'm wrong, but I do get a sense that there's quite a negative connotation about subterranean issues. I use the example of mining, where we can talk about high degree of risk. The history of mining has got a high death rate associated with it, exploitation of workers, unsafe conditions. Think of dark, cramped spaces, and so on and so forth. And I guess one of the propositions or the challenges that you as the industry have is to try and change mindsets. Do you think what my own perception might be versus what you're trying to get us to think out the box? Is it valid, and how, if so, are you going about unpacking this? Any thoughts and responses to that, Abby?
Thank you very much, Pete, and yeah, thank you very much, everyone. So far, we've had some very fantastic insights. So with regards to the negative connotation of subterranean works, it's all down to practice, and it's all down to regulations. And what I would say, in most developed climes where you have the matured industry, there are set guidelines and there are set procedures that basically are there to be followed in terms of what is required in terms of developing underground space infrastructure. And I would even like to go a little bit beyond, this proposition that you've put out here in terms of, the obvious risks in terms of extraction. So of course, when you talk about the fact that the challenges, I was, faced with one of such examples very recently, where an artisan miner were back in Nigeria. Basically, they were digging for tin, and they basically forwarded a video to me, and straight away, the proposition that this is risky, this is, in as much as they are there to basically exploit the situation and look to get the end product, one of the things we're looking to do, especially from the point of the ITA, which myself, I represent Anne and Antonia, is to ensure that as part of the what we're trying to do in terms of promoting on the ground space use, the best practices that we basically put ahead and we put forward, and we ensure that that is basically captured in whatever proposition or proposals we put forward. Now, to flip this aside, like I said, I'd like to take it an extra step forward. So in terms of the positives of it, when, I'll give an example. I think it was during the World Urban Forum about 2 years ago or 4 years ago, we were approached by a planner. I'm not sure if it's a planner in Joburg or Cape Town, where they had abandoned mines. Now, there are examples of this all over the world, where you have mines and you have excavations. All, like I said, from the word go, when we're looking to propose activities that will cause or create, such scenarios where you would abandon, the space, or you would have mines or cavities that would be more of an environmental challenge, we need to actually look at ways where a reuse or refunctionality or refunctioning of that space can be integrated from the word go. So you're basically, like Anne said earlier on, there's a kind of multifunctional or a forethinking of that space, how you're going to be using that space. If you're extracting, there has to be a plan or a proposition to replenish or to refunction that space. So perhaps what I would also do now is I'll probably allow, if there's anyone, I'll probably reckon anyone part of the panel, either maybe Anne, to touch a little bit more on that, to give more specific examples of where I know that maybe we basically applied a kind of repurposing of mines that can come straight to mind.
Yeah, what we're going to do there, before I bring Han in, and Han, I'd like to hear your thoughts on this, is once we've done that, colleagues, we're going to start to look to wrap, and I'm going to ask each of the panelists to give a very succinct sort of couple of sentence summary of what they've heard. Again, colleagues are welcome to still type any final questions in the chat box, but we are going to need to start to wrap, particularly recognizing people's time on this Sunday. So Han, over to you, sir. Then we're going to work our way backwards from Imran, Amara, through to Antonia, and Abby, I'm going to give you the last word, sir. So Han, after you, sir. Thank you. Yeah,
I just wanted to come back to your point about your perception of the subsurface, and I think you're not the only one that has that perception, Peter. I think that the issue that we have is that the subsurface as such is what I would call non-charismatic, in the sense that we talk very positive about it, but its image is not all that great. Nevertheless, I mean, already we've had some pointers during this 1 hour about things that we need to be concerned about. Flooding, legislation, land ownership just came up as well. I think what we need to do is we need to look at the opportunities that are there. We need to focus on how can we actually use the subsurface in different ways? How can we integrate it with surface developments? How can we repurpose or spaces that already exist? And obviously mines, in that sense, abandoned mines, could offer quite some interesting opportunities. I put a link in the chat about a project in the south of my country, where they're reusing old mine shafts for as a heating solution for the city. But mines, in a sense, also can also pose a danger to cities. You could have collapse of mine shafts or galleries, and have enormous sinkholes appear in your city. So it's all about the knowledge we have about the subsurface, knowing what is there, knowing how we can possibly use it to solve some of the major issues that cities have, and that differ from cities across the globe.
Thank you so much, Han, and thanks for your observations and shares this evening with us. Really appreciate it. Coming to you there, Imran in Lahore. your final sort of summary and thoughts on what you've heard this evening? We'll come back to Imran. Let's come to Amara there in Chicago.
Yeah, so this has been just a really fascinating discussion. I really quite enjoy talking about it, partly because it's an area that I'm not the most familiar with. But I do think that it's worth noting, just kind of in summary, looking into or not overlooking human behavior and the psychology that's tied to underground space when we think about use. So in our regular urban planning conversations, we often think about what is the highest and best use of space, and this notion of being in the outdoors and green, the green environment, and how this is something that we consider to be good, even a public good, if you will. And I think we should think about some of those conversations also as it relates to underground space, that there is a component beyond just utility and beyond sort of the technical components of whether it's transportation or storage or building buildings that go underground. There's a component that has to speak to our psychology about underground space and how we exist, how we show up in that space, both in terms of understanding what barriers might exist to adopting broader thinking around the use of underground space, but also from a planning perspective, because we don't have as much leeway with underground space, frankly. So if there are unused mines or abandoned mines, or if there's flooding or other mishaps, we just don't have as much leeway with underground space. So it requires that much more forethought into its planning. And we have to incorporate, I know in aviation, they use the term human factors. We have to incorporate those human factors in our design and our planning from the outset. So just wanted to leave that as a final comment.
Thanks so much, Amara. Again, hugely appreciated, and love hearing your insights from that side. Thank you. Imran, can you hear us now? And would you like to respond, sir? Thanks very much.
Yes, there was some problem. So in closing, I'll say that we need to leverage our underground space to make our cities more resilient. And when we put our framework of resilience along with the other issues of informality and urban poverty, especially in cities of South, we're excited to make opportunity lying underground really a way forward. And that we see that as a great prospect. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Imran. As I come to Antonia and Abby, I'm going to sort of push you here hard, which is on the one hand to summarize, but there is an important question that's come through on a couple of the chats here around the regulatory environment. And I think Hannah's talked about it slightly, but between the two of you, if in your summary you can just touch on that, maybe that's a particular interesting topic for another session around the regulatory framework and what needs to change and that whole mind shift that has been talked about. But Antonia, to you, and then Abby, I give to you to summarize and wrap completely the session. Antonia, thank you so much.
Yeah, Pete. So to be honest, we've only managed to scratch the surface, literally, in the conversation, because once we look at the subsurface, we have such a complexity to deal with, not just in terms of geology, but also in terms of aspects. We've heard human factors, we've heard, we've touched on various of these in terms of infrastructure development, in terms of population growth, in terms of climate, in terms of resilience. And we've also said, like Amira said, the human factors. But in terms of legalities, this is really something that is differently handled from place to place. And we're seeing a strong increase in various countries to actually form special legislation or form adapted legislation, because a lot of countries have the aspect that the owner or the property owner owns the subsurface till the center of the earth, like in Japan or till recently in Singapore. And this is, of course, then completely contradictory with projects such as mass transport systems in cities or other vital infrastructure. Switzerland is now embarked in a big conversation all the way up in Parliament, because we're building a cargo souterrain project. So actually really for cargo to take it off the road, to take it off the trucks and move it underground. And we need to really have an own legislation for this, because there is no legislation. And it's like in the Wild West, as we say in our book, it's first come, first serve. And that's not a way to go about it in the future. So there will be much more discussion on the legal aspects in the future. That's my 2 cents to this one.
Thank you so much. And again, hugely appreciate your insights. And I hope people have been able to see more about the book that you've been involved with and where they can find out more. You should look that up. I've had a quick look myself before coming onto the call. Very, very interesting, and we'll definitely be looking at this further. So thank you. Abby, you put this together. Want to thank you for your efforts in getting almost 20 people on the call this evening from around the world, a truly global and diverse range of professionals and interested groups. The last word is yours, sir, and thank you for your efforts this evening.
Thank you very much, Pete, and thank you very much, everyone. And I'd like to say thank you to the panelists. You know, a week might look so long, but for a lot of people, it's a short notice. And to have your Sunday evening, you know, 1 hour of your Sunday evening, depending on where you are, it might be your afternoon or, you know, whatever the time is. And for someone like Nicola or Imra, who are like it was almost midnight. Thank you very much. So this is just the beginning. I did mention to Pete, you know, this is like, it's like an icebreaker, and like Antonia said, with what we've been doing in terms of awareness and promotion and education, it's like we're literally just a tiny scratch of the surface. And you know, and this would lead us nicely, because we're looking at different ways by which we could engage decision makers and policy makers. And the reason why we ensured that the panel was a little bit divergent was so we could have, you know, outcomes that we have from today, where we're looking at things from different perspectives. And to add to that as well, also for us to be able to kind of like challenge ourselves to think, you know, strategically beyond, you know, the normal way, or the normal the ways we'd normally think about these challenges previously. And so just to give us an heads up of what we'll be potentially looking at next, we're looking to engage the African Free Trade Continental Agreement through the African Union on how on the ground space could form a part of the framework in enabling seamless movement through the African Free Continental area, which is basically an agreement that the African Union has just signed and is being driven aggressively and strategically. I know Amara is also part of that forum as well, and it's something we'll be looking at some point before the end of the year, and would also like to solicit, you know, your participation in this, and you'll be informed as at when due. But thank you very much once again, everyone. I absolutely appreciate this, and I hope, you know, that this has left a little bit you know, of thoughts, you know, in our minds, you know, just for us to go back and think about the underground space, you know, in ways that we've perhaps never even thought about before. Thank you very much, everyone, once again. And if you would like to have the video, would just let us know, and we'll be able to forward the link of the video to you once we have it from the cloud.
Abby, as we conclude, just to confirm, you will make this link available. I'm sure there are people, given the time differences, who would like to at least reflect on this. I think those of us who've taken part would want to come back and think about it, think about what we've heard, and maybe share with our own internal networks. So in due course, if you could share the link, that'd be really appreciated. And on behalf of everybody who's taken part today, thank you to you for taking the time and effort for setting this up, Abby, for getting us to think a bit out the box on Cities Day. And all the best, colleagues. Keep safe, keep doing what you're doing and making the difference. And for taking the time, it really, really was an outstanding event. I learned a lot. and appreciate the time and the efforts and the skills that were on show this evening. All the best, colleagues. Look after yourself.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Good luck with the
Thank you.
elections tomorrow, Pete.
Thank you. We're going to need it. We're going to need it. Watch this space. All the best, colleagues.
Okay, cheerio.
Thank-
Bye, Abidemi. Thanks for
Thank you,
organizing.
Antonia. Thank you, Anne.
Cheerio.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye, Imran.
Bye, everybody.
Thank
Bye,
you.
Olivier. Nice you joined.
Thank
Bye,
you,
Fermi.
Olivier.